Hello, pen people. Back again with another unscripted and kind of impromptu video, but today I'm going to be talking about filling mechanisms for fountain pens. And the first ones I'm going to talk about are eyedropper fountain pens. And essentially, this is not a filling mechanism. There's nothing within the pen itself. It's not a self-filling pen, but it is a way of filling a fountain pen. And so let's get into it. Here we have, well, let's talk about the origins of fountain pens. So originally, when people wrote with ink, they wrote with things like this, which is a reed that was sharpened, this one in kind of an oblique, and you would dip it in ink and then you would write with it. And obviously, it's got some drawbacks. I'm sure you can do beautiful artwork with it, and many people have through many ages. However, it's not something that would be very easy to write very long texts with any sort of rapidity. Although, again, that has been done. But through the ages, we moved up through the reeds up to quills, and I don't have a feather quill. But then we moved into the steel pens, and that is where steel nibs were made, and they were often put inside of a holder. Often when you had to be put into a holder, and here's one that's an offset holder, where it holds the steel pen in it, and you dip it in the ink, and then you write with it, and then every little bit you have to dip and write and dip and write, dip and write, dip and write. And again, it served people for a long time, and they were, a lot of wonderful works were written with steel pens. But as innovation and modern things came upon us, some new developments like making the pens. So this is the pen. Today when we talk about a pen, we're talking about a whole unit. But back in the day, the pen was actually this piece right here, and that's why it says pens on this box. This Esther Brooke box, it says pens, and these were the pens. So this is the pen, and this is the holder. This one comes from the 1850s or thereabouts, and it's made out of gold. And it does the same job as one of these steel pens, a very soft, flexible writing instrument. But again, you're dipping it in the ink and then writing and dipping and writing and dipping and writing. And so it's something that, while it works, it's not terribly efficient. And so it wasn't long thereafter that, or actually contemporary to this, people were attempting to use fountain pens where you filled a reservoir behind the nib and it would leak down into the nib and you could write. But the problem is they all leaked until some innovations came along and people were able to figure out how to do what they call the air ink interchange, where the ink leaks out just enough to where you get an actual working fountain pen, where the barrel of the pen is filled with ink. And this is a very old one, as you can tell. There's no threading here. It has an overfeed. There should be an underfeed, but it's broken. But the way these pens worked is that you unscrewed the section that holds the nib, and this one has this long weird feed thing on it. But then you would pour ink down in there, or use an eyedropper to do so. You would open up your bottle of ink, suck some up in the eyedropper, and then drip it down into the pen, and then you would then screw this back on, and the threads and the tightness, and this is actually still quite tight, would seal the reservoir, and the only way for the ink to come out would be down through the nib, and then you would write. And so the first successful fountain pens were these eyedropper types. Here's another one with some mother of pearl on it, but again, the section unscrews, and you would fill it up and then screw the section back on. And the earliest of the Waterman pens and other companies were these types of eyedropper fillers. And it has some drawbacks. I mean, let's talk about the advantages. Oh, no, let's talk about the drawbacks first. One of the biggest drawbacks is the fact that, of course, it's fiddly. You've got to unscrew this thing. You've got to get yourself an eyedropper, and you've got to get, and then put the ink into the pen. And that's a little fiddly. It's a little messy. You're going to get ink on your fingers, sort of thing. but then when you write with the pen, there's something that happens, and what that is that as you hold the pen in your hand, the warmth of your hand warms up the pen itself, and the combination of ink and air in here will begin to expand, particularly the air. As the air gets warmer, it will expand inside the barrel and it will start pushing ink out, and that's what we call burping, where you'll write along and all of a sudden you'll have a big splot of oil, big splot of ink come out, and it's frustrating. And so these early eyedropper fountain pens had that issue, and the modern ones do too. And so even though this is probably the most primitive of all of the types of so-called filling mechanisms for fountain pens, they still exist, and there are quite a lot of them, actually. It's just keeping with the old-time eyedropper fillers. Let's see. Let's look at this one. Let's look at a couple of these. So these are from the 1920s. And these are safety pens. And so safety pens have not a filling mechanism, but they have a retracting method for extending and retracting the nib in the pen. And so this one, you twist the tail cap and the nib moves in and out. And the way it works is that when you retract the nib, you fill the barrel with ink. You drop drops of ink in there, and it fills up that barrel, and then when you screw the cap on, it screws down tight and it seals up that barrel. And so no matter what position this is carried in, ink will not leak out, and that's why it's called a safety pen. And then when you're ready to write with it, you unscrew this cap, and then you extend the nib, and the collar around the base of the nib seals up the end of the barrel, and just enough ink comes through the feed to the nib so that you can write with it without it barfing ink out all the time. It still can, because it's still essentially, when the nib is extended, it is an eyedropper. This is another type. It's just a push-pull made by Moore, and it's a much more simple mechanism than the twist screw type of the Waterman, but it works on the same principle. It's an eyedropper, and you close up the cap, and the ink reservoir is open when you do that, but then when you extend the nib, it won't pour out when you tip it down. Anyway, so that's another type of eyedropper pen. This is another one. It's another one of those Waterman type. It's just a smaller one. And you can see this one's inked. It's got some ink in it right there. This one occasionally gives me issues where it burps a little bit when I'm writing with it. But as long as you're writing, it tends to keep up without having issues with the ink pouring out. But again, these things are really fiddly. You see how long it takes to open and close that. Well, there's another type of eyedropper pen out there that has an innovation that is actually quite useful, and they were known of in older times. This is a very old Japanese pen, and it's an eyedropper like all the others. You unscrew the section, and you see this thing right here. This is the innovation. This is a shutoff valve. And the way this works is that you open up the barrel, and then you use your eyedropper to fill it up, to fill up the barrel, and there's a seal down at the bottom here so it doesn't just come pouring out. And then you screw your section back on, and then when you tip the pen down, ink will flow to the nib and you can write with it. But to control the ink flow, you can close this valve, and when it's screwed tight, that pointy end indexes into a similarly shaped conical recess in the bottom of the feed, and it closes off the ink flow to the feed, so that when you don't want too much ink flowing down to the nib, you can actually just crack it open, let some flow down, and close it, and you can write for a while and without having any worries about it burping up ink or anything like that, regardless of the interchange of heat or anything that's going on there. And so this is a very old one. This was a somewhat old one. This is a more modern but still at least 50 years old one. This one has issues where I tend to leave the back unscrewed. This is the shutoff valve. And when I do that, ink will go out around the nib and still come out. Anyway, no filling mechanism will keep you from getting ink on your fingers. Let's just say that. Anyway, they're beautiful. It's a beautiful writing pen. This is a Swan pen, but with no affiliation to the Swan pens from England or America, as far as I know, because these are all traditional eyedroppers with shutoff valves. As is this one. This is called a Ford pen. I don't know any other information about it. I just know it's made in Japan, out of ebonite. But like I said, these things continue, and there are modern makers of eyedropper pens today. In fact, one of the places that you're most likely to get an eyedropper fountain pen from is India. And I have a lot of pens made in India. Here are a few of them. And all of these pens are eyedropper fountain pens. There are modern versions of the Moore type of safety pen, where you have the nib retracted, and this one's conveniently clear acrylic so you can see what's going on. There's the nib right there, and you open this up and you pour the ink in there, and then when you're ready to write with it, you push it forward, and the ink chamber is still here and it's still intact. It's not going to leak out, and this seals up tightly enough around the collar here so that you can write with it and not really have much issue with the ink pouring out. But then when you want to close it, you pull that down, which again opens the barrel. So you never want to tip this while it's with the nib retracted, because the ink will just pour out. And then you close it up and that seals it. So these are still being made, and these are Noodler's pens, but they're made in India. But there's also I believe some other makers who are still making safety pens today. In fact, here's one that's kind of interesting. This one is made by Montegrappa. This is not an inexpensive pen. This thing is rather expensive. This is the Mia Carissima. It too is an eyedropper pen. It is a modern eyedropper pen. In fact, the package it comes in comes with a bottle of ink and an eyedropper. It's similar to this one, but with sterling silver fittings. Anyway, the way this one works is that when you want to fill the pen, you twist the knob at the bottom. It retracts the nib. You drop the ink in, and then you extend the nib to seal the barrel, but then it will write through its beautiful ebonite feed. This one is different in that, though, you don't need to retract the nib to cap it, which is kind of nice. So modern safety type fountain pens still exist. And modern eyedropper, the straight up eyedropper fountain pens still exist as well. All of these pens, it's particularly easy with these clear pens to see what's going on here. You have the section which you hold. You've got your nib and your feed, and that's it in this part here. And the feed extends down into the barrel, and then to fill this up, and we'll just show you what it looks like when you fill it. Not that and this is just diluted water with just a hint of ink in it. So you fill up your eyedropper, and then you just drop the ink into it. And you can see one of the advantages of an eyedropper pen is that they have a huge ink capacity. You can put a lot of ink into these pens and write for a very long time with them. And then you would screw the section back on. And you're going to get, it's going to be a little messy. You're going to wipe it off. And then so now you have a filled pen, and which is great, and these typically do write well. And if you keep the pen as full as possible, you're less likely to have problems with the air expanding and pushing the ink out. But it's when it gets to about half full, from then on, it's almost always a constant issue, unless you have a shutoff valve like those Japanese style ones. So you can see that's how all of these here work. These are all eyedropper type fountain pens. This is another safety pen. Even this tiny little thing right here, this skinny little Gamma, it too is a little eyedropper pen. You open it up, and there's the end of that ebonite feed coming through, and then you just eyedropper it full, and this tiny little pen goes to work. I think this is called the Gamma Mini. It's a cute little thing. Oh, it's Guider. Sorry. To all you Indian pen aficionados out there, this is made by Guider. Anyway, so these are all eyedropper type fountain pens. One of my favorites is this great big I think that's a Guider Super Zimbo, and you can see that there's a, a, a ball bearing in there. That's a stainless steel ball bearing. I sometimes put those in my eyedropper pens, particularly if I'm using a shimmering ink, and that it acts as an agitator, kind of like a paint can. You can rattle it a little bit, and it helps keep the ink moving down towards the nib. That's something I occasionally do. There's one kind of an exception here. This is an Indian pen. It is an eyedropper-ish, but it has, you can see, a filling mechanism. Well, this one, it was designed that you can take that out and then you can use it as a straight-up eyedropper. So you have the option of it being an eyedropper or using that filling mechanism. That is not unusual. There are many pens out there, in fact, some made in India, that have multiple filling mechanisms. And I will mention them now because we're talking about eyedroppers, and that's one of the aspects of these multiple fill type pens out there. Eyedropper fountain pens are also being currently made in China and Taiwan. Here's a Chinese made one. This is Taiwanese made. This one is full. You can see what's going on there. This is a Opus 88. And I've done an odd thing where I removed the nib and feed and put in one out of a Pilot Parallel. But you can see, well, maybe you can't, but there's a shutoff valve in there. If you screw it back, let me keep going, because you don't usually need to back it off this far. I'm just doing it so you can see what's going on. You can see it moving up and down in there. And that when this is screwed all the way shut, ink from this barrel will not flow through to the feed, and so it will starve it from ink over time, but it also keeps it from burping, and it allows you to transport it without having spilling issues. And Opus 88, I think almost all of their pens are of this type, where they're eyedroppers with shutoff valves. And I have others of them somewhere, but I'll they're all, like I say, very similar. Now, this is another one. This is also made in China by Moonman, or Majan as they're known now. This is what they call the egg, I guess. And this one is strictly an eyedropper, where it's got an O-ring right here to help seal it. And it seals against the surface right there. So you would eyedropper it up to the level of that ledge that's in there. And then screw this in. And right away. And this is actually one of the best eyedropper pens I've ever used. I've never had an issue with this one burping ink on me. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that inside of here, there's this finned feed that can help buffer some of that flow of ink. Another one, here's another one made by Pen BBS. This one is a very small reservoir here, but it's an eyedropper. And you can put the cap on the back and make it into a full-length pen. It's kind of a pocket pen. You'll find that there are several types of pocket pens that are eyedroppers. And here's one that's a rather new one. It's made by Wancher, which I believe is out of Japan. I don't know if this is made there, but it doesn't really matter. This one is called the Puchiko. And you can see how tiny this little thing is. There's no way to fit a filling mechanism in here, so all you do is you unscrew this section. And there's an O-ring there, and then you drop ink in there. I'm not going to take this one apart because it's got orange ink in it right now, and it's a good little pen. You can see it writes even on glass. Super, super tiny, super cute. So this is by no means all of my eyedropper fountain pens. There are a lot of them out there, but just remember there's two different kinds. There's the kinds that do not have any kind of a shutoff mechanism. There will be a varying reliability because you're going to have problems with the air and the ink flowing and occasionally burping on you. Some buffer those a bit, and I guess this was a good one to show that here. You can see kind of through here that inside there, you see all those fins. Those are there to buffer. So what it can do is, like, if too much ink starts coming through, it will fill up those fins instead of just pushing it out the tip. And as you write, then the fins will gradually, the ink in the fins will gradually go out through the nib. And anyway, that's one way of buffering that problem of the burping. And that's why these ones have less of a problem with it than many of the older and the more simpler eyedroppers. The other option, of course, is to put a shutoff valve like in these Opus 88s and in a lot of the vintage Japanese pens and even modern Japanese pens like the Namiki Emperor. Anyway, so that's eyedropper pens, and I will see you again soon, and we'll talk about another filling mechanism.